My parent took everything from me to support my addict brother. They lost the house because of my brother's gambling habit. Now I'm the only one who can save them. Growing up, my parents always had a favorite, my younger brother, Jake. He was the baby of the family, the one they coddled and spoiled, while I was the responsible one who had to fend for myself. No matter what I did, Jake always came first. But Jake had a dark side. By his late teens, he had fallen into drug use, and as his addiction spiraled out of control, my parents bent over backward to protect him. They spent thousands on rehab, bailed him out of legal trouble, and paid off his debts when he borrowed money he couldn't repay. Where did all that money come from? Me. I had been saving for years to buy my first home, juggling 2 jobs while finishing school. When I finally had enough saved, I told my parents about my plans, thrilled to take my first big step toward independence. Instead of celebrating with me, they begged me to loan my savings to help Jake. "He's your little brother," my mom said, her voice trembling. "You're his big sibling. You have to help him. Family comes first." I refused. I explained how hard I had worked for that money and that Jake had already burned through too many second chances. That's when they went behind my back. Without my permission, my parents drained the savings account I had opened as a teenager. Because I had foolishly listed my mom as a co-signer, she had full access to the account. By the time I discovered what had happened, the money was gone, used to pay for yet another expensive rehab program for Jake. When I confronted them, they didn't even show remorse. "We had no choice," my dad said. "You'll make the money back, but Jake needs help now." That was the day I realized I couldn't trust my family. I moved out a week later, rented small cheap apartment while I figured out my next steps. My parents were furious, accusing me of being selfish and abandoning them during a crisis. I cut all ties, determined to build a life on my own terms. For years, I struggled to make ends meet while climbing the ladder in my career. Meanwhile, Jake's problems only worsened. He added gambling to his list of vices, racking up debt faster than my parents could pay it off. Eventually, they lost their house. Jake had gambled away the money they needed to cover the mortgage, and foreclosure became inevitable. They downsized to a cramped rental, clinging to the hope that Jake would finally get his act together. But he didn't. Years passed, and I finally found success. I landed a great job, bought my dream home, and even started my own business. Life was good, until my mom called me out of the blue one evening. Her voice was shaky, filled with desperation. "We need your help," she said. She explained that Jake had burned through every resource they had left. He was in deep debt to some very dangerous people, and my parents were on the brink of eviction. "You're the only one who can save us," my mom pleaded. "Please, we're desperate." A storm of emotions hit me: anger, sadness, and a bitter sense of vindication. After all the pain they'd caused me, they were now coming to the very person they had cast aside for help. I told her I'd think about it, but in truth, I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to help. They were still my family after all. But another part of me felt that this was their reckoning, the price they had to pay for their favoritism. After my mom's call, I couldn't stop thinking about everything they had done to me. Every memory came rushing back: how I was treated as the responsible one, expected to sacrifice everything for Jake. How they drained my savings without a second thought. How they chose to support him through every mistake, no matter the cost, while I was left to fend for myself. I spent days debating my next move. On one hand, they were my parents, and despite everything, a small part of me still felt obligated to help. On the other hand, I knew that giving in would only enable their toxic cycle of favoritism and Jake's destructive behavior. Finally, I made my decision. I told them to meet me at a cafe so we could talk in person. When I arrived, my mom and dad looked worn down, years of stress and worry etched into their faces. Jake wasn't there, which I was grateful for. I didn't want to see him. "Thank you for coming," my mom said, her eyes welling up with tears. "We're in a really bad place," my dad added. "We've tried everything, but we just don't have the resources to keep going. We need your help." I took a deep breath. "I understand that you're struggling, but I need to be honest. The way you treated me growing up, the way you prioritized Jake over me, it broke something in me. You stole from me to support him, And now you're asking me to clean up the mess he created? We did what we thought was best at the time, my mom said defensively. Jake needed us. And what about me? I shot back. Did I not deserve your support? Or were my sacrifices just expected because I wasn't your golden child? There was a long silence. My parents exchanged a look, but neither of them could meet my gaze. I've worked hard to build my life without your help, I continued, and I'm proud of what I've accomplished. But I can't keep enabling Jake's behavior. If I give you money, it won't solve the problem. It'll just delay the inevitable. So you're just going to let us suffer? My dad asked, his voice rising. No, I said firmly. I'll help, but on my terms. I'll pay for a financial advisor to help you restructure your debts. I'll even pay for a therapist for Jake if he's willing to get help. But I'm not giving you a blank check, and I'm not bailing him out again. My mom burst into tears, while my dad sat in stony silence. I knew they didn't like my terms, but I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I was setting boundaries, and it felt empowering. I left the cafe with a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a lingering sense of guilt. My parents had made their choices, and so had I. Over the next few weeks, I followed through on my promises. I connected them with a financial advisor and offered to cover the initial consultation. I reached out to a therapist who specialized in addiction and sent Jake the information. But true to form, Jake refused to go to therapy. My parents continued to make excuses for him, and their financial problems only worsened. Eventually, they stopped reaching out to me, likely upset that I hadn't handed over a pile of cash. Months later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that my parents had sold their rental home to cover Jake's debts and were now staying with friends. Jake, meanwhile, was still gambling and using drugs. I felt a pang of sadness, but I reminded myself that their situation was a result of their choices. I had done what I could to help without compromising my own well-being, and that was enough. Months passed and life moved on. My parents' silence was deafening at first, but eventually, I grew to appreciate the peace. It allowed me to focus on my work, my friends, and my own happiness, things that had always taken a backseat to my family's chaos. Then, one day, I received an unexpected message from my mom. The tone was different, calmer, almost apologetic. She explained that they were struggling more than ever, that Jake was still spiraling, and that they were desperate. But at the end of the message, she wrote something that struck me. You were right. We made mistakes. We should have treated you better. If you can't help us anymore, we understand. But I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For the first time, it seemed like my mom had truly reflected on the choices they had made. It was bittersweet. Part of me wanted to forgive her, but another part of me remembered the pain I had endured, the betrayal, the neglect, the constant feeling of being second best. I decided to respond. I appreciate your apology, I wrote. It means a lot that you're willing to acknowledge the past. But the truth is, I can't keep sacrificing my happiness and stability to fix problems I didn't create. I'll always wish you and Dad the best, but Jake's issues are beyond anything I can solve. He needs professional help, and until he's ready to accept that, nothing will change. I hope you both find peace, but I have to put myself first now. I hit send and felt an immediate weight lift off my shoulders. A few weeks later, I heard through the same mutual acquaintance that my parents had finally reached a breaking point with Jake. They had cut him off financially, forcing him to confront his issues head-on. He had checked himself into a long-term rehab program, though I didn't know if it was out of genuine desire to change or sheer desperation. As for my parents, they had moved into a small apartment and were starting over. It wasn't an easy road, but they were slowly piecing their lives back together. I didn't reach out. I wasn't ready to rekindle that relationship, and maybe I never would be. But knowing they were taking steps to improve their situation gave me a sense of closure. As for me, I thrived. My business grew, I traveled to places I'd always dreamed of visiting, and I surrounded myself with people who appreciated me for who I was. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free, not just from the burden of my family's expectations, but from the guilt and resentment that had weighed me down for so long. Sometimes, I think about Jake and my parents and wonder if things could have been different. But then I remind myself that I can't change the past, only learn from it. In the end, I realized that the best way to break the cycle wasn't to fix it for them, it was to build a better life for myself. And that's exactly what I did.